Right, so welcome back to the Year 11 Poulter's Pod science video. We're going to carry on with this genetics, variation and evolution topic by doing two lessons. The first on what genetic engineering is, some examples, the pros and cons, and then the second lesson we'll look at actually the actual process about how we do genetic engineering. So let's start off with our little introduction then. So genetic engineering is where you're transferring genes from one organism to another. Okay, so an example would be what we've done is we've taken the human insulin gene, so from human beings, and we've actually put that gene into bacteria. And you might be thinking, well, why would I want to put a human gene into bacterial cells? Well, the reason we do that is that the actual gene will work and function quite normally inside that bacterial cell, and the bacterial cell will actually manufacture what we call the gene product. So remember, earlier in the topic we learned what genes are. They're sections of DNA that code for a particular protein or characteristic. And in this case, the insulin gene is telling the bacteria to make human insulin, and therefore the bacteria is actually producing it. And this is where, if you're a type 1 diabetic, all of our insulin is now produced through genetically modified bacteria. There are many, many other applications of this. That's just one example. And I've got some in the presentation to show you. One really crazy one is they've actually taken a gene from a spider, the gene for making silk, and they've put it into goats to make a sort of spider goat. Now this goat isn't going to be climbing up on the ceilings and it's not going to have a spider sense like Spider-Man, but it can actually produce spider silk in its milk. But again, why would we want to do that? Well, the reason for that is silk is actually an incredibly useful material. It's incredibly strong and flexible. In fact, it's tensile strength, which is the pulling strength. You imagine you've got a bit of cotton and you try to pull it until it snaps. That would be its tensile strength. The tensile strength of silk is more than that of steel. In other words, it's stronger than steel. And it's also flexible and elastic. And it could be used in a variety of like construction materials, even like these sort of bullet resistant vests. At the moment you have to have like Kevlar, which is super heavy plastic to resist bullets. You can make something similar out of silk and it'd be a fraction of the mass. We could also, because it's a biological protein, we could even use it in medical applications, maybe making new, people having new knees and hips, joints and stuff like that, could work really well for that. Kind of stitching during surgery, it'll break down because it's protein based. Fantastic. These seem a little bit far out there. What is probably more common when it comes to genetic modification is what we call GM crops. Now GM, if you ever see this, or GMO stands for genetically modified, in the case of GMO, genetically modified organisms. So we want to do this for our crops, and there are many major advantages for doing this. So genetically modified crops might give us higher yields, so they produce more food per unit of crop. They also might produce more nutritious foods as well. Rice, for example, is notoriously very low in vitamin A, and if you were only to eat rice, you'd actually go blind because it's so low in vitamin A, and vitamin A is important for healthy eyesight. So what they've done is a genetically modified rice, they call it golden rice, to up the vitamin A content in it. So actually you don't have this problem of blindness if your diet is solely rice. Not only can we make it more nutritious and more food, we can also make our crops pest resistant. That means that we don't have to use expensive and environmentally harmful pesticides on our crops. Our crops will actually be able to resist and potentially kill any pests that want to feed on them. So highly effective. We can make them herbicide resistant as well. So we don't have to, when we want to get rid of competitive weeds that might be growing in the crop field, we can spray herbicides on the field, which will kill the pest plants trying to compete with our plant, but it won't kill ours because it's resistant to it. So there's just a few examples, as well as we can use it for making medicines and medicine production, or even treating genetic diseases, which we'll talk about in our second lesson. So there, a nice little overview of the advantages of genetically modified organisms. Let's move on to our next section. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is what are the potential disadvantages, dangers of genetically modified organisms and particularly genetically modified crops. Now, some people are rightly or wrongly afraid of genetically modified organisms. Some of the major downsides and the worries that we have with them is if you're making them for food production, we don't necessarily know what the long-term health impacts might be of eating genetically modified organisms. Probably little to none, but there is some concern there about what the long-term effects are. We just don't know yet. Another problem is we've created these organisms that are potentially, pest resistant, herbicide resistant. There's a chance they could actually pass on those genes to other wild species. Plants will regularly hybridize with other species, and they could transfer those genes to other species in the environment, which could make them very, very difficult to control. You imagine having a weed in your garden that you couldn't kill with herbicide, or it was resistant to pests. It would spread very rapidly and maybe cause some problems. By introducing GMOs into the environment as well, we could disrupt food chains. That's another kind of a negative downside with them. So there's just a few there. There's some more in the PowerPoint for you guys to have a look at. I'd say pick at least 3 advantages and disadvantages for you guys to remember, just in case you have to apply them to an exam question. So that gives you a nice little overview, quite a short one this, but I think that's all we need to talk about what genetic engineering is. In our next video, I'm going to teach you how we actually are able to transfer genes from one organism to another. So this is Dr. P signing out. Have a good one. Cheers.